Good morning. I wanted to talk a little bit about Toni Morrison's The Site of Memory. So, Toni Morrison opens with this notation. She says, "My inclusion in a series of talks on autobiography and memoir is not entirely a misalliance. Although it's probably true that a fiction writer thinks of his or her work as alien in that company, what I have to say may suggest why I'm not completely out of place here. For one thing, I might throw into relief the differences between self recollection, which is memoir, and fiction, and also some of the similarities, the places where those two crafts embrace and where that embrace is symbiotic, meaning that it's in partnership. But the authenticity of my presence here lies in the fact that a very large part of my own literary heritage is the autobiography. In this country, the print origins of Black literature, as distinguished from the oral origins, were slave narratives. These book length narratives, autobiographies, recollections, memoirs, of which well over 100 were published, are familiar texts to historians and students of Black history. They range from the adventure packed, so for example, the life of Olaudah Equiano's, the interesting narrative of the life of Olaudah Equiano, or Gustavus Vassa, the African, written by himself in 1769, to the quiet desperation of incidents in the life of a slave girl, written by herself in 1861, in which Harriet Jacob, or Linda Brent, records hiding for 7 years in a room too small to stand up in. And she goes on and on to talk about other slave narratives. So, one of the earliest questions, I think, in relationship to this essay is, where do your memories reside? Where do your memories reside? So, where do you store those parts of yourself that are a part of who you are, the way in which you operate, the way in which you make decisions? And then, what are your earliest memories? So, memoir versus fiction, this idea of similarities and symbiosis. So, relationship, how do the two work together? So, Morrison tells us that there are two intentions of the slave narrative. And the first is to say, this is my historical life. The second is to say, I write this text to persuade other people that we, meaning the slaves or the enslaved, are human beings worthy of God's grace and the immediate abandonment of slavery. So the purpose, twofold. One, this is my life. Two, I am a human being. So in other words, the purpose is to change things. So then the obvious question becomes, well, how does one who studies literature criticize or critique these narratives? Because they are directed at those who could terminate slavery. So if they are called biased or improbable or inflammatory, then one has to look at the purpose of the narratives as the motivation for its writing. Morrison then tells us how many copies slave narratives sold. So she says that Frederick Douglass's narrative sold 5,000 copies in 4 months. Equiano's narrative had 36 different editions. 36 editions of his narrative. William Wells Brown, his narrative was reprinted 4 times in a single year. And then she also mentions Moses Roper's book, which had 10 editions over the course of 19 years. And Solomon Northup's sold 27,000 copies in 1 year. So now the two initial intentions, this is my historical life, and we are human beings worthy of God's grace. But then the third intention, Morrison says, is to prove literacy and obtain power. So it's about assuming and proving humanity, because a literate slave was supposed to be a contradiction in terms. This is the age of scientific racism, where we have Kant, who says that if someone was black, it is clear proof that he is stupid. Or Thomas Jefferson, who says no black uttered a thought above the level of plain narration. So a black person could tell a story, but they did not have any critical thinking related to that story. Or Hegel, who says Africans have no history. But Morrison lets us know no slave society in the history of the world wrote more or more thoughtfully about his own enslavement than African American slaves. However, even in this writing, writers avoided the more violent, degrading moments. And she mentions a few quotes: not to be described, or turn our attention to the less repulsive, or I am not about to harrow the feelings, or but let us drop a veil over those proceedings too terrible to relate. And so, because the writers did not want readers to be caught up in the pity or the sentimentality or the feelings or emotions, they discouraged the reader and discouraged themselves from relaying the parts about slavery that would have given someone pause, that would have made someone maybe emotional in response. And what is also missing, Toni Morrison says, is the interior life. What is missing is the interior life. So Morrison decides that it is her job to rip that veil drawn over proceedings too terrible to relate. Morrison sees it as her job to rip the veil drawn over proceedings too terrible to relate. So moving the veil requires three things: trust one's own recollections, depend on the recollections of others, and employ the imagination. So then these memories within are the subsoil of her work. So Morrison says that these memories are the subsoil of her work, because writing is these five things: thinking, discovery, selection, order, and meaning. Writing is thinking, discovery, selection, order, and meaning. And then after that, we have awe, reverence, mystery, and magic. So Morrison says that this is the problem. The discourse proceeded without the subject. The discourse proceeded without the subject. So then the solution comes from literary archaeology. So she says that on the basis of some information and a little bit of guesswork, you journey to a site to see what remains were left behind and reconstruct the world that these remains imply. So she reconstructs the world of slavery based on what she's able to find about slavery, and then she fills in the blanks. So what makes it fiction is the nature of the imaginative act. She says, my reliance on the image, on the remains, in addition to my recollection, to yield up a kind of truth. So she says that there's a separation of fact from fiction. Fiction can dispense with what really happened, but fact must be traced to something publicly verifiable. So her work generally falls into the realm of the fantastic. Morrison says it may be excessive, it may be interesting, but the important thing is that it's random. Facts, and this is a quote, can exist without human intelligence, but truth cannot. Facts can exist without human intelligence, but truth cannot. So she says, so if I'm looking to find and expose a truth about the interior life of people who didn't write it, which doesn't mean that they didn't have it, if I'm trying to fill in the blanks that the slave narratives left, to part the veil that was so frequently drawn, to implement the stories that I heard, then the approach that's most productive and most trustworthy for me is the recollection that moves from the image to the text, not from the text to the image. So she plumbs the distinction between fact and truth. In other words, she sees and then she remembers. So Morrison uses her father's death as an example because his death allowed her to write Song of Solomon. And Morrison attempts to reconstruct his world and life. So her family is her entrance into her own interior life. The nature of her research begins with a figure or a voice. For example, a dimly recalled figure, the corner of a room. And then she talks about Sula, where she says, I began to write my second book, which was called Sula, because of my preoccupation with the picture of a woman and the way in which I heard her name pronounced. Her name was Hannah, and I think she was a friend of my mother's. I don't remember seeing her very much, but what I do remember is a color around her, a kind of violet, a suffusion of something violet in her eyes, which appeared to be half closed. But what I remember most is how the women said her name, how they said, Hannah Peace, and smiled to themselves. And there was some secret about her that they knew, which they didn't talk about, at least not in my hearing. But it seemed loaded in the way in which they said her name. And I suspected that she was a little bit of an outlaw, but that they approved in some way. And then thinking about their relationship to her and the way in which they talked about her, the way in which they articulated her name, made me think about friendship between women. What is it that they forgive each other for? And what is it that is unforgivable in the world of women? I don't want to know any more about Miss Hannah Peace, and I'm not going to ask my mother who she really was and what did she do, and what were you laughing about, and why were you smiling? Because my experience when I do this with my mother is so crushing. She will give you the most pedestrian information you ever heard. And I would like to keep all my remains and my images intact in their mystery when I begin. So what she says is she doesn't want to know the truth. She wants to invent it. She wants to create it from the memories that exist in her mind and in her heart. And so then she talks about beloved. And what she says is, what I want to do in this talk is to track an image from picture to meaning to text. A journey which appears in the novel that I'm writing now, which is called Beloved. I'm trying to write a particular scene and I see corn on the cob. To see corn on the cob doesn't mean that it suddenly hovers. It only means that it keeps coming back. And in trying to figure out what is all this corn doing, I discover what it is doing. I see the house where I grew up in Lorain, Ohio. My parents had a garden some distance away from our house, and they didn't welcome me and my sister there when we were young because we were not able to distinguish between the things that they wanted to grow and the things that they didn't. So we were not able to hoe or weed until much later. I see them walking together away from me. I'm looking at their bags and what they're carrying in their arms, their tools, and maybe a peck basket. Sometimes when they walk away from me, they hold hands. And they go to this other place in the garden. They have to cross some railroad tracks to get there. I am also aware that my mother and father sleep at odd hours because my father works many jobs and works at night. And these naps are times of pleasure for me and my sister because nobody's giving us chores or telling us what to do or nagging us in any way. In addition to which, there's some feeling of pleasure in them that I'm only vaguely aware of. They're very rested when they take these naps. And later on in the summer, we have an opportunity to eat corn, which is a one plant that I can distinguish from the others, and which is the harvest that I like the best. The others are food that no child likes: the collards, the okra, the strong, violent vegetables that I would give a great deal for now. But I do like the corn because it's sweet, and because we all sit down to eat it, and it's finger food, and it's hot, and it's even good cold. And there are neighbors in, and there are uncles in, and it's easy, and it's nice. The picture of the corn and the nimbus of emotion surrounding it became a powerful one in the manuscript I'm now completing. So she goes from a memory to creating text around the memory to fill in the blanks in her memory with creation. And as an editor, she noticed author processes from image to idea to text. One example is the Mississippi River doesn't flood. It just remembers the way it used to be. So a rush of imagination then is our flooding. So Morrison says that her work is to extend, fill in, and complement slave autobiographical narratives. So at the end of the essay, there is a bit of Q&A. And so she talks about minor characters, and she says that she gives them work to do because if not, they'll distract her and take over the narrative. And she wants to also encourage a sort of intimacy in the reading in which the reader is under the impression that he isn't really reading this, that he is participating as he goes along. And that part is key to Morrison. that the writing of a narrative isn't singular, it's participatory. In some way, it's a call and response. She says it's unfolding and he always gets to be 2 beats ahead of the characters and right on target. So Morrison says somewhere else, she says it like this, that she creates gaps for the reader to fall into. And so in so doing, in the same way that Morrison read narratives of slavery and found gaps that she could fall into herself, when she writes these fictional memoirs, she is also creating gaps for our readers or ourselves to fall into in the same way. That we become a part of the making of the text. And so ultimately, she asked the question, what might they have known? Because even if they didn't talk about it, we're again talking about the slave narratives, they give us enough information for us to learn about the lived experience of people. So the site of memory then is a place that we begin creation. So we go back to the first question, where do your memories reside? And what is one of your earliest memories? And she wants to collapse the distinction between fact and fiction. Because from her perspective, fiction is part fact and fact is part fiction. So that creation then is that moment of symbiosis where the fict and the faction come together. Fact and the fiction come together to create. And that is the site of memory.